We're back. You are chatting with John P. Today, I'm going to be talking about some types of watches, including some examples of particular watch models, and why some people should avoid these models. Because we have Delray Watch, delraywatch.com, where we buy, sell, and trade watches, we get a really interesting perspective, both myself and Federico from Federico Talks Watches. We get a really interesting perspective kind of into the trends of fellow watch collectors, why they put certain things in their collection, why they take certain watches out, and we make sure to catalog that. Insight like this can be very helpful in making sure that we stock the watches that people actually want and not just kind of what comes across the desk, even though there is a little bit of that as well. But I have found some trends, just asking, as well as some of the cataloging we have, on why people traded in watches. And I think that some of this might be incredibly not only insightful, but helpful for those of you that are out there either new to watch collecting or you're trying to kind of build out your watch collection and perhaps you haven't kind of really delved yet into these types of watches. So I will get into that. But first, I'd like to show you on the wrist today, I have a Zinn 556, one of the more entry-level Zinn models, but I would say that the one thing that Zinn absolutely gets right is the hard rock durability of their watches across the board. And fun fact, actually, some of the earliest Bell & Ross watches were actually produced by Zinn. So when sometimes people say, oh, Bell & Ross have, these rugged, durable watches, arguably, well, fun fact, Zinn actually developed them. And there's kind of some cross-pollination, I guess you would say, between some brands in the earliest times of Zinn and Bell & Ross and so on and so forth. I'll cover that in another video, but I just wanted to share that fun fact and let you know we do also have this and some others at delraywatch.com and many Rolex watches as well. So right away, the first watch category that you should avoid if you're this type of person is vintage watches. And the type of person is if you're very active or you buy a lot of water. Let me explain. With vintage watches, and I see this all the time, vintage watches that get traded in because unfortunately there was some damage or the mechanics really weren't there for this type of person. If you're active and you put a lot of stress and shock and force on the moving components inside of the watch, mechanical watches, especially, deprecated technologies in mechanical watches without proper shock absorption, which tend to be the more collectible watches, to be honest with you, there's going to be some issues with timekeeping, dust getting into the case. The seals on old watches, especially chronographs, they're not made to handle what watches that are produced today can handle. There's a much difference. There's a lot of technology advances, and this can be problematic for some people. And they put their vintage watches on the time grapher, and it's not keeping chronometer spec, and they want it to, but it's a very old watch, and the parts have kind of worn down. And personally, I would say that this is very charming. I love vintage for actually the same reasons. It's a little bit more rare when you compare them to contemporary alternatives or even within the same brand line. It's a little bit more rare, a little bit more special, more artistic in the nature of the collection than just the utility. And I personally like that, but sometimes people get into vintage and they expect to have this rugged, durable watch like something like the Zinn, and they can bang it around. And trust me, if you knock around a vintage chronograph in the same way that you knock around a modern watch, not even a lot, but just a little bit, you're gonna have problems with it. And not everybody likes that, especially if the watch has to go out for service, and then you have downtime without a watch. And so generally I recommend vintage. Either you love it for those reasons I mentioned before, or you have other watches that you can wear every day. Otherwise, I probably would avoid it for the other reasons. Next, perpetual calendars I would avoid if setting your watch and you don't have a watch winder is a big issue. Now let me explain. Perpetual calendars can compensate for the changing in the differences of the days, though with perpetual calendars, we have to take into consideration that there are a lot of registers, right? You have the time, you have the day, you have the date, and you have to keep up with that. And sometimes there's not always pushers where you can just kind of push the pusher. Sometimes you have to use the crown in conjunction. And certain perpetual calendar movements, you have to do things a very certain way. And so for those that are a little bit more new to watch collecting and they don't need the functions that the perpetual calendar provides, or honestly, depending on where you're at on that scale of how comfortable you are setting your watch, or you really wanting to every day, if you don't wear that watch every day with triple calendars, moon phases, even Rolex Day-Date non-quickset for that matter, it can oftentimes be a little bit of a discouraging process for those that don't enjoy that kind of feeling or connection and the integration of human man machine type feeling that you get, if that makes sense. Some people love that feeling, some people don't, and so I would avoid perpetual calendars in similar types of day-date functions if you just don't want to have to be setting your time all the time if you have other watches. Next, we have Kickstarter watches. Now, for many, this is going to be a no-brainer. I encourage you to watch the rest of the video because I do introduce other types of categories of watches that you might find a little bit more interesting. But with Kickstarter, especially if you see the word transparency or a transparent model or cutting out the middleman, that is all fluff. Maybe the first couple of businesses that made it to that Kickstarter watch campaign were successful in that regard. The movements, while many watch collectors look down on them, and honestly, I do from a perspective of the mechanics of a watch. From a business perspective, they were ultimately very successful, and that's generally companies on Kickstarter or companies that are going in that direction to more mass produce this pretend transparency. That's kind of the direction they're going. It's more of a business model, more of a commodity, and less of a watch or enthusiast watch. Generally, they're quartz driven, or there's very little attention paid to the details and making sure the watch is of quality. So I would avoid Kickstarter watches. That being said, if you see something that's kind of cool and you just have some disposable income that whatever reason you felt compelled for some reason to support that company, go ahead, do it. I personally don't have any problems with what you spend any of your hard-earned money on, but I wouldn't consider most watches on there to really be serious watches. Next, we have gold watches, precious metal watches, particularly gold watches. Now, I generally don't wear yellow gold or rose gold watches. For me, they tend to be a little bit on the flashier side. I have a couple, but I don't wear them as much as I wear stainless steel watches, especially living in an environment that's very casual here in South Florida. The thing to keep in mind also with precious metal watches, gold watches, is that gold generally, we're not talking about some of the more reinforced, more durable versions of gold, but gold is a softer metal compared to something like a stainless steel. And so when you're wearing a gold watch and a gold sports watch, to give you the most extreme example, and you're banging it around, even if you're not, it just kind of, maybe you kind of run your wrist on the desk at work, or you knock it into the doorknob or something like that, or you bump it into the car, or someone at the grocery store, Whole Foods aisle bumps the card into your watch, which is completely out of your control, by the way. There's going to be a much greater chance that damage was done to the case of the watch, and the only way to fix that, well, there's two ways. You can have it polished and properly brushed depending on the model, but it's going to remove metal from the case, making it look much different in shape over time, especially with multiple polishes. Or you can find someone that specializes this and they can technically laser weld more metal back on the case of the watch to kind of regain more of that original shape, but that comes at a very steep price, and then you have issues with actually modifying the case. And I've seen some botch jobs where metal was added back to the case, and it's just not the same because you can get pretty close for the actual particular gold formulation. All gold that's being used, it's going to have some different elements added. The colors are going to be a little bit different, especially with modern. It's not going to be perfect. So you have to take that into consideration. Gold watches are something that are not for everyone, but they do serve a place and a purpose, and many people do enjoy them, and I admit I enjoy them on occasion. Next, this one is going to be controversial, but I will explain, and I know some people, and the people that own these will probably agree with me, is that FP Journe generally, and these very limited production, relatively limited production, independent manufacturers should be avoided from people that need workhorse movements that are not going to break. Now, Journe is credited with so many technological advancements in horology, and there's more to be said about the watches in terms of their artistic value and kind of the methodology, as well as their beliefs in the way that they handle watchmaking today, with kind of that original vintage inspired mentality that some brands have kind of put by the wayside today in favor of production and marketing. And so with Journe, while the movements tend to be much more complicated than they need to be, And FP himself has had many reasons why he has done things a certain way. It's not always for the betterment of the actual timekeeping or long-term serviceability or even short-term serviceability or consistency of the movement working properly. It's always generally has these other reasons that come with it, which have value to many people. But when some people get into a watch like a Journe, once again, that's almost kind of in that same category as vintage, where it takes a little bit more hand-holding. There's some more nuances, especially with the maintenance and the serviceability of the watches. That is enough to kind of be off-putting for some, right? We're talking about Journes that are oftentimes in the same ballpark price as Rolex, but the Rolex is going to have a movement that has had so many iterations out over the course of the last so many decades and is proven workhorse over and over and over. Movements are used from sports watches to more dressier watches over and over and over again, whereas with Journe, we're talking about super limited production and not really verified at scale. So you do have problems, and we get Journe collectors that call us all the time, and we've had Journe through the door, honestly, which we have had to send for service, and Hans has had to work on them, and sometimes, some of these watches have to go back to Journe because they do break, and there's certain things that they did for reasons that are not necessarily for the benefit of the serviceability and consistency of the timekeeping of the watch. So I know that's going to be a little bit controversial with Journe owners, but I know those that have actually had to send the watch in, and trust me, when you send a Journe in for service, for base model Journes, you're talking about a service of no less than $2,000 plus, and their service prices are kind of a name your own price thing. So you send it to them and it's like they control the whole thing, and there's very limited insight and alternatives for really who can service that Journes based on the parts and so on and so forth. So something to keep in mind for those that are kind of ogling and hoping to kind of put a Journe in their collection. I still like the brand, but for those other reasons, perhaps someone would avoid it. And lastly, I want to mention that I generally see a lot of people turning in watches or trading in watches or selling watches that did not resonate with them, but they were kind of the hot watch du jour. Believe it or not, there are many people that didn't like the Batman. They bought it, it was the hot watch, they kind of wanted to be seen with it, or they bought the Hulk, or recently we're seeing a lot of Kermits come through the door. And they bought it, it was cool, it was the hot thing, and then it really wasn't something that they felt belonged in their collection. Now, some of those examples I gave, obviously those people made a little bit of money along the way, but the increasing Rolex prices is just something that's happened in recent times. This is not necessarily here to stay forever, and the same trend can be seen with other watches as well. We see Omega Speedmaster collectors oftentimes trading in. We see limited edition watches that are super hot, the Alaska Project, the Snoopies, and then the prices come down a little bit, and then they get let go because they were super hot, and people want to talk about it and be part of that camaraderie, and they realize, the watch really wasn't for them. It doesn't say anything negatively about those particular watches or the brands or anything about that product, but what it does show us is that sometimes people kind of get caught up into buying whatever's the hottest thing, and then they realize it's not for them. Sometimes they do well with it, but sometimes they do take a bit of a hit depending on the market value. So that's a decision you need to make, but I just wanted to share that with you because I see that a lot. And generally, it doesn't make a big difference either way because market price is market price. But if this can help you, more than glad to see it. So what do you guys think? Do you have any other advice that you'd love to share with people? Perhaps any horror stories of types of watches that you got into, or any watch models that you particularly purchased, but perhaps it wasn't for you and you either made a little bit on the back end or perhaps not so much? I would love to hear it in the comments below because once again, we do tailor your experience at delraywatch.com directly from the comments, questions, etc. that you leave down below. Thanks guys, we'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.